He's my adopted grandson. I raised him, saved his life when he was a kid. And at dinner, in front of the whole family, he splashed water in my face. I didn't scream. I didn't leave in tears. I taught him a lesson. No words, no revenge. And he'll never be the same again. Subscribe so you don't miss a story. In the comments, would you forgive? The long mahogany table glistened under the weight of silverware, wine glasses, and dishes too perfectly arranged to be touched yet. Polished to a mirror's shine, it reflected the golden chandelier above, swinging ever so slightly with the draft of the heating vent. The house was silent, but for the low murmurs of guests arriving, hanging their coats, complimenting one another's outfits, and awkwardly offering smiles steeped in obligation. I stood quietly in the hallway for a moment, my coat draped over one arm, clutching a modest bouquet of fall chrysanthemums I'd bought with the last of my week's grocery money. A young woman I didn't know, a niece by marriage perhaps, offered to take the flowers and coat, her practiced smile faltering just a little when I said thank you. She hadn't expected me to speak, maybe not even to come. But I always came to Thanksgiving, every year. It had once been my holiday to cook, to carve the turkey, to set the table with the same devotion I'd once given to stitching wounds or soothing sick children. Now, I was a guest, a relic. They'd never say it aloud, but I knew. Some of them still called me Miss Louise. Others said Grandma Lou out of habit more than affection, but none of them, not anymore, looked at me the way he used to, the one I came for. I spotted him across the room. Andrew. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a navy blazer with brass buttons that caught the light. His hair, darker than when he was a boy, had begun to grey at the temples. It suited him. He was standing near the fireplace, one arm around his wife's waist, the other holding a lowball glass filled with something amber and expensive. He was laughing, the sound full and sharp. People listened when Andrew spoke. They always had. Even as a child, his voice carried further than others. He didn't see me at first. Or maybe he did and chose not to. That would be more like him now. Someone called my name, a genuine voice, one of the older family members, perhaps a cousin, and I nodded politely, pressing a smile onto my face. I moved slowly toward the table, where place cards were already set. My name had been carefully printed in cursive on a cream card, placed at the far end of the table beside a few of the younger children. A strategic seat, out of the center, out of the photos. Dinner began the way these gatherings always did. Wine poured, toasts made, laughter stretching a little too wide over old stories retold with fresh polish. The turkey was carved with fanfare, platters passed along with practiced ease. I took only a little. My appetite had long since learned the difference between hunger and habit. I watched him through the steam of my mashed potatoes. Andrew, now seated at the head of the table, his back straight, his fork resting lightly against his plate. He looked every bit the man his father had hoped he'd be, a provider, a patriarch, a force. But I remembered the boy who once clung to my hand when thunder frightened him, who used to sit on the kitchen floor while I washed collards, asking if angels could hear our thoughts. Halfway through the meal, after the clatter of cutlery had settled into the murmur of conversation, someone asked the guests to share something they were thankful for. A family tradition, one I'd started decades ago when Andrew was still small enough to need a step stool at the sink. Each person spoke in turn. Thanks for promotions, for engagements, for healthy children, for escaping layoffs. The usual. And then it was my turn. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the stem of my water glass. My voice was hoarse from disuse, but I lifted my chin and spoke clearly. I'm thankful, I began, for a day many years ago, A day when I happened upon a child in trouble, a little boy who needed someone, anyone, to be brave for him. I held his hand while the ambulance came. I sang to him so he wouldn't feel alone. And though the world has moved on, and many have forgotten that day, I never did. There was a pause, small but heavy. I saw a flicker of something in Andrew's eyes, a twitch of his brow. Recognition? Annoyance? I smiled faintly, returning my gaze to the table. Sometimes we forget who held us when we couldn't stand. It was meant gently, a reflection, a memory offered without demand. But the silence that followed was tense, like a string drawn too tightly across a violin. Andrew chuckled, just once, a sound sharp as snapped glass. "Are we doing parables now, Miss Louise?" he said, not looking at me but at his plate. "Or are you trying to make us feel guilty before dessert?" The table froze. No one moved. Even the children went still, the air thinning around us. I opened my mouth to respond, softly, kindly, but he wasn't done. "You've told that story before," he said, still not looking at me. "And every year it gets a little more dramatic, doesn't it? I mean, really, do you want applause?" My heart knocked once, then steadied. "No," I said. "I want nothing but to remind the room of kindness, that's all." He laughed again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not family, Louise. You were part of the household. We appreciated you, but that doesn't mean you get to rewrite history." His wife nudged him, her hand light on his sleeve, but he brushed it off. "You keep coming here, sitting at our table like you belong here, telling stories no one asked to hear." And then he reached for his glass. It was water, cold, still beaded with condensation. He raised it, slowly, and with a flick of his wrist, he threw it in my face. A collective gasp. A child whimpered. His father's fork clattered to the floor. And for a moment, no one moved. The water soaked my blouse, ran down into my lap. I felt it in my ears, my collar, clinging to the lines of my face. But I didn't flinch. I reached calmly for a napkin, blotted the drops from my chin, then looked at Andrew. Really looked. "You always did hate being reminded of where you came from," I said. He sneered. "I know exactly where I came from." "No, baby," I replied. "You know where you ended up. That's different." And with that, I stood. No dramatics, no crying. I adjusted my coat around my shoulders, picked up my purse, and looked one last time at the people I'd helped raise, feed, love, and who now sat frozen in their own shame. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "only a cold splash can wake someone from the sleep of forgetting." And then I left, stepping out into the November chill, the door closing behind me with a whisper. I didn't look back. The house was different back then. Not the brick and glass palace Andrew lived in now, with its polished steel appliances and beige walls devoid of warmth. No, this was a modest colonial near the edge of town, where the lawn grew wild in places, and the kitchen always smelled faintly of lemon polish and cinnamon. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I first saw him. I wasn't working that day. My nursing job at the county hospital only required me Mondays, Wednesdays, and weekends. I'd walked to the store to buy sweet potatoes, eggs, and the coffee I liked. The dark roast, the kind that took its time steeping. I remember the wind tugging at my scarf as I left the store. The air had that early spring wetness, like the ground hadn't fully thawed from winter. And then I heard it. A scream. Not the kind from children playing, but sharp, urgent. A woman's voice, desperate. And before I could even register the sound, I saw him. The boy lay sprawled across the pavement near the school crossing, his arm twisted oddly beneath him, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. A car had skidded several feet away, the driver pale and panicked behind the wheel. No one moved. Not the woman on the corner. Not the teenager fumbling with a cell phone. But I moved. I ran to him, dropped my bag without thinking. His eyes were wide, glossy with unshed tears, and blood trickled from his hairline down the side of his cheek. He was too still, too quiet. That's what scared me most. "I'm here, baby," I whispered, kneeling beside him. "Don't move. You're safe now. I got you." He didn't respond. His lips were parted slightly, breath shallow, his chest fluttering like a frightened bird's. I checked for spinal injury. Nothing obvious. Then gently elevated his head using my scarf. People stood around us like statues. One woman finally muttered, "I think he goes to Jefferson Elementary." "I don't care what school," I snapped. "Call an ambulance." I took his hand, small, soft, warm, and held it firmly. He squeezed it. That was when he started to cry. He didn't sob. He just let silent tears roll down the sides of his face. His mouth trembled. And through cracked lips, he said something I'd never forget. "Don't leave me." I shook my head. "I won't, sweetheart. I'm right here." The ambulance arrived in under 10 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. I rode with him. The EMT didn't protest. Maybe it was the way I held him, like I was born to do it. Maybe it was the blood on my scarf, the steel in my eyes. When we got to the hospital, they asked for a guardian. I told them I wasn't family, but I had training. He was rushed into the trauma room. I waited just outside, pacing the tiles, my coat streaked with dirt and his blood. Hours passed. They called for an orthopedic surgeon, then a pediatric neurologist. I stayed in the waiting room until I couldn't sit anymore. I made calls to the emergency contact number listed in his school record. His parents were out of state, a business trip in Chicago. They were on a plane back, but wouldn't arrive until morning. So I stayed. When they wheeled him into a recovery room late that night, the nurse on duty said he kept asking for the lady who held my hand. I entered the room quietly. He was drowsy from the medication, but his eyes fluttered open when he heard my steps. "You came," he murmured. "I told you I would." He reached for my hand again. The same hand he'd gripped on the pavement. His fingers were so small, his skin still sticky with antiseptic and dried sweat. "Are you an angel?" he asked. I smiled. "No, baby. Just a woman who walks with her eyes open." "Can you stay?" "I can stay." I sat there all night. They brought me a blanket at one point. I didn't sleep. I watched his chest rise and fall. I memorized his name from the chart. Andrew Joseph Whitmore, 8 years old, allergic to penicillin, blood type O positive. Favorite color, he whispered the next morning, was green like the jelly beans. When his parents arrived mid-morning, they were tearful, shocked, apologetic. His mother was a stern-looking woman with weary eyes. His father shook my hand too long, too hard, as if trying to transfer some part of their guilt. "You saved our son," his mother said. "We don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," I said. "Just love him right." But love isn't always straightforward. Gratitude isn't always graceful. After that day, Andrew clung to me like ivy. When I left the hospital, he cried. When I visited him at home weeks later, he ran into my arms. His mother pulled me aside. "He's changed," she said. "He doesn't want his old nanny back. He wants you. Would you consider staying?" I didn't have children of my own. I'd never married. I'd poured myself into medicine, community, and faith. But something about this child, something fragile and fierce, had taken root in me. I agreed. At first, I was the nanny, then the governess. Then, quietly, I became a part of their household. Andrew called me Grandma Lou in private. I helped with homework, wiped tears after night terrors, made his favorite grilled cheese with the crusts trimmed just right. When he scraped his knee, he ran to me. When he had a nightmare, it was my room he crept into. I loved him like he was my own. I taught him kindness, not with rules, but by example. When the neighbour's dog tore through the flower beds, I didn't yell. I offered to help fix the fence. When a classmate called him a name on the bus, I told him, "Hurt people hurt others. You don't have to follow their lead." And for a while he listened. He grew tall, fast, clever, too clever sometimes. He learned how to charm, how to talk his way into and out of trouble. By the time he was 14, he didn't call me grandma anymore, not around his friends. "She's just the housekeeper," he told one boy when I brought them lemonade. The words stung. I didn't let it show. He was growing, after all. Every child rebels in their own way, but I felt the shift. He started to pull away, not violently, not cruelly, just coldly, with the slow erosion of years. By the time he left for college, he barely hugged me goodbye. I sat on the front porch that day, my apron still damp from doing laundry, and watched him disappear down the driveway. He didn't wave. Years passed. He married, had children, took over the family's legal business, made speeches, appeared in magazines, built a mansion. I was invited to birthdays, to holidays, to Christmas mornings where I sat in the corner while new nannies, white and crisp in their uniforms, handed out presents. I was part of the decor, a piece of the past they kept around out of respect, like a well-worn quilt folded neatly on a shelf. I never reminded him, not until Thanksgiving, not until he threw water in my face in front of his children, his wife, and a dozen people who didn't know who I really was. He'd forgotten, but I hadn't. And now, I knew what I had to do. The walk home that night was long. Not because of the distance, it was only 10 blocks from Andrew's house to mine, but because of the weight I carried in my chest. I moved slowly under the street lamps, past houses trimmed in icicle lights, and porches crowded with pumpkins still lingering from Halloween. The November wind bit at my cheeks, but I didn't pull my coat tighter. I let the cold settle into my skin. He had done it. He had humiliated me without flinching, without even an ounce of hesitation in his voice or his eyes. The boy I had held in my arms, the child whose screams I had soothed, had stood at the head of a table I once fed him from and thrown a glass of water in my face. And yet, there were no tears. There was no room for them. Not after all these years. Not after I had learned the difference between pain and sorrow, between anger and disappointment. What I felt was something quieter, something still. A silence so deep it echoed inside me like an empty church. I unlocked my front door with steady hands. The house greeted me with stillness. No barking dog, no clock ticking on the wall. I had sold the ticking 1 year ago when its sound became too loud for the loneliness. I hung up my coat, kicked off my shoes, and lit a small lamp in the corner. Its amber glow spread across the living room like warm honey. I sat in my old chair, the one with the worn arms and frayed cushion, and folded my hands in my lap. My reflection in the window looked back at me, older than I remembered. Stronger, too. I thought of Andrew's face, not the man he had become, but the boy who once crawled into my bed after nightmares, who once slipped his small hand into mine as we crossed the street, the child who asked if God made brown angels too, the child who once called me family. He hadn't just forgotten what I did. He had forgotten who he was. And I had let him. That was my failing. I had allowed my love to become silent. I had let my place in his life shrink, until even I began to believe I didn't belong there anymore. I had allowed him to forget the story, thinking one day he'd remember on his own. But he didn't. So I would remind him, not with bitterness, not with anger, not with the venom he used so casually at that table. No. I would teach him the way I always had, with patience, with truth, with love that stood even when it was no longer invited. I rose from my chair and turned on the desk lamp in the corner. The desk was old, oak, with a drawer that stuck if you didn't pull it just right. I opened a fresh page in my notebook, uncapped a pen, and began to write. It wasn't a letter. It was a story. A parable, perhaps, though I never called it that. It began simply, as all true things do. Once, there was a woman who walked through the world with open eyes. She saw pain where others looked away, saw beauty in what others called broken. One day she found a boy lying in the street, hurt, afraid, forgotten by everyone but her. She knelt beside him. She held his hand. And because she did, he lived. I wrote slowly, carefully, choosing each word like a thread in a quilt. The story didn't name him. It didn't scold or accuse. It only remembered. I wrote of a boy who forgot and a woman who didn't, of a family that let love rust into obligation, of a table where once there had been laughter and now only performance. And at the end, I wrote this. The woman did not ask to be remembered. She asked only that truth not be buried, because love, when silenced too long, becomes a ghost. I folded the paper gently, slipped it into an envelope without a name. Then I went to the old box in my closet, the one where I kept photos no one had asked for, drawings made by a 5-year-old hand with stick figures and crooked hearts. From the very bottom, I retrieved the photograph. It was small, almost faded, black and white. The hospital's camera had printed it the night he was admitted. I was holding his hand. His tiny fingers curled tightly around my index finger, mine aged and steady. A nurse had taken the shot, saying it was the most beautiful thing she'd seen that day. I slipped the photo into the envelope. Then I closed it. The next morning, I mailed it with no return address, no stamp of accusation, just memory, sealed and delivered. That was lesson 1. Later that week, I received a phone call. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. Louise? A voice whispered. I knew it instantly. It was his mother. I saw what happened, she said. I should have said something. I should have stopped him. It's not your burden, I replied gently. She was quiet for a long moment. I remembered that photo from the hospital. I had a copy once. I always thought you'd be in his life forever. I was, I said, just not in the way he needed. She started crying, softly. The sound of a woman who had spent her life arranging flowers over silences. Do you think he knows what he did? I thought for a moment. Not yet, but I think he's beginning to feel the weight of it. She told me she was sorry, that she loved me, that she had failed me. I told her love was never a failure, only forgetting was. We hung up without making plans to meet. There was no need. She'd said what needed saying, and in her tears, I saw the first fracture in the fortress Andrew had built around his pride. That was lesson 2. The third came 2 days later in the form of a crystal glass. I had an old friend who ran a little engraving shop. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called him and asked for a special request, he didn't hesitate. He delivered the item personally. A short glass, like the one Andrew had used. Clean, clear, simple. Around the rim, he engraved words I had chosen with care. Only an empty vessel can receive the truth. I packed it in a small box with no note, no explanation, just the glass. And I sent it to him. He would recognize it immediately. He would understand the weight of it eventually. People like Andrew didn't respond well to confrontation, but they responded to symbols, to things they couldn't argue with. He could dismiss my story. He could throw away my memory. but he couldn't escape a glass that mirrored his own action, only now emptied, silent, waiting. I sent the package, and then I waited. I waited not with vengeance, but with the quiet knowing that time works in circles, that the boy I once saved still lived somewhere beneath the man who tried to erase me, and when he was ready to remember, I would be here. It was a Sunday afternoon when the knock came, not the brisk, confident rap of a delivery man or the polite triple tap of a neighbour. This knock was hesitant, unsure, like the hand behind it wasn't certain it belonged there at all. I had been in the kitchen warming soup. The radio was playing something soft and instrumental, and for a moment I let it continue, not moving, not answering. I suppose some part of me already knew who stood on the other side of the door, but I didn't rush. Redemption, like good cornbread, couldn't be served raw. When I opened the door, he stood there alone. No car idling behind him. No wife beside him to prompt or protect. Just Andrew. Just the man I had known in every age, now fully grown, his pride quietly dismantling itself piece by piece in the chill air between us. He looked different. Not in his face, though there were more lines there now, more grey edging his temples, but in the way he stood. Shoulders not squared with arrogance, but sloped, almost folded inward. His eyes didn't meet mine right away. He looked at the step, at the doorframe, at his own shoes. Then, finally, at me. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," he said. I tilted my head. "But you knocked." He gave a soft, bitter laugh, almost ashamed. "I did." I stepped back, leaving the door open. I didn't speak again until he'd crossed the threshold. Even then, I let the silence hold between us for a while. He needed to feel the weight of it, not as punishment, but as witness. He stood awkwardly in the living room, hands clasped before him like a child sent to confess. "I got the package," he said after a long moment, "and the story, and the picture." I nodded once. "Did you recognize yourself?" He sat. Not on the couch, but in the small wooden chair near the window, the one children always chose when they were unsure whether they were welcome. "At first," he said, "I didn't want to. I thought maybe it was just symbolic, a story you wanted to tell. But then," his voice dropped. "Then I remembered the nurse." I turned toward him. He was staring at his hands. She used to tell the story to new staff, about the woman who stayed the night, who held the boy's hand, who wouldn't leave even when the parents came. She said you changed that boy's life before he even knew how to spell his last name. He swallowed hard. That boy was me. He looked up finally, and there was no pretense in his face, no bluster. Just a man sitting in the ruins of what he'd built out of forgetting. "I was awful to you," he said. "Not just at Thanksgiving. For years." I didn't answer. "I told people you were just the housekeeper. I didn't correct them. I didn't stop them. I let you fade so I could rise." Still, I was silent. He stood suddenly, as if the shame had grown too hot to sit with. "I don't even know why I did it. Why I threw that glass. You weren't saying anything wrong. You were just telling the truth." "You weren't ready to hear it," I said gently. "I don't think I've been ready to hear the truth my whole life," he whispered. "Not from you. Not from anyone." I nodded. "And yet, here you are." He paced the room slowly, looking at old photographs on the mantel, images of people he'd never met, faces he once saw in passing. Then he stopped at one photo, the most recent. It was the same one I'd sent him, his tiny hand in mine, the hospital bracelet still visible on his wrist, the background a blur of machines and quiet light. He reached out and touched the frame with the tips of his fingers. I don't deserve your forgiveness. No, I said softly. You don't. He turned around sharply, startled. Forgiveness isn't something anyone deserves, Andrew. It's something we give. Or we don't. You can't earn it. He looked down again. Are you giving it? I walked over and sat on the couch. My knees ached more these days, but I didn't let it show. I patted the seat beside me. He hesitated, then crossed the room and sat. I don't forgive the man who humiliated me at that table, I said. I forgive the boy who still lives inside him. The boy who once asked if God made brown angels too. The boy who cried in a hospital bed and clung to my hand like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. He was crying now, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears, slow and stubborn, tracing lines down his face. I miss that boy, I said, and I've been waiting a long time for him to come home. He reached for my hand. It was different now, larger, rougher. But when his fingers closed around mine, it was the same gesture. A circle, finally closing. I remember everything, he said. Now I do. I remember the grilled cheese, the songs, the way you used to say my name when I was afraid. He paused. I'm so sorry I let go of you. I squeezed his hand once. You can always take hold again. We sat like that for a while, the light softening around us as the sun began to dip below the rooftops. There were no more words needed in that moment. Only presence. Only the knowing that something broken had begun to mend. He didn't leave right away. He asked if I had tea. I brewed 2 cups. We drank them in silence, the way family sometimes does when there's too much to say and no hurry to say it. When he did leave, he hugged me. Not the kind of hug people give out of habit. The real kind. The kind that presses sorrow into redemption and lets it rise again as grace. I'll be back, he said at the door. I know, I said. And he was. A month later, there was a photographer at the house. Andrew had arranged it. Said he wanted his children to meet me, really meet me. Not just as a name or a dusty title, but as who I was. They sat on either side of me. One in my lap, one holding my hand. And Andrew stood behind, his arms around us all. He insisted the photographer take one more picture, just of the 2 of us. Me, in my armchair. Him, kneeling beside it, my hand resting on his shoulder. A week later, I received a framed copy. He had written something in neat, blocky penmanship across the bottom. Miss Lou. Light. Memory. Strength. Thank you for waking me up. I hung it in the front room, and every morning I passed it on the way to the kitchen, where the radio played soft gospel and the kettle sang, and the windows let in light that was never too cold, never too late. He had become that boy again, and I was still here. Subscribe for more stories. Watch the next video or explore others on the channel. Share this one if it meant something to you.